psychiatrist husband made me sign a 15-page recovery contract while I was still bleeding, filmed me sobbing about our dead baby, labeled as increased compliance, and when I begged him to stop drugging me, he just sighed, "They're just supplements. Your paranoia is a grief symptom." I stayed silent, knowing whatever he was giving me, I was about to use to destroy him. One moment I was 6 months pregnant, then suddenly I wasn't. The doctor's words floated somewhere above me as he explained what placental abruption was while my husband Marcus pulled out his notebook, not holding me, not crying, just his pen scratching paper while my world ended. 3 days later, he stood at my hospital bed with a leather folder. His psychiatrist's voice was calm and clinical. "We need structure for your recovery. 15 pages of rules, daily mood tracking, supervised medication." He asked for my signature at the bottom, and just like every other time he drew up a contract for our relationship, I signed my name like my soul belonged to him. He installed cameras in common areas for my safety, and started timing my mother's visits with his phone and taking notes when she held me. Something felt off, but grief made everything feel wrong. He started making all my meals, which would have been nice if they didn't taste like cardboard. After every breakfast, I took these pills that made me sleep for 14 hours. Once I woke up, the world outside was dark, and I was alone. When I caught him crushing extra white tablets into my smoothie, he sighed. "They're just supplements. Your paranoia is a grief symptom." I couldn't help but think, then why were my hands always shaking? Why couldn't I remember the day before? 2 months after I lost the baby, I saw papers on his desk. Hospital commitment forms with my information filled out. My blood went cold. A few nights later, I got an email that said, "You don't deserve him." When I showed Marcus, he said, "Delete it. Probably spam." But something lodged in my chest, a splinter of doubt. I started hiding pills under my tongue. The clarity came in waves, terrifying waves. I'd lost 30 pounds. My phone had 0 missed calls because he'd blocked everyone. Then came the day I was the clearest I'd been in over a year. He was away at a conference, and he left his laptop on the table. My finger hovered over the mouse pad. Did I really want to know? Yes. The folders were labeled by date. Inside each one were videos, our private conversations, me sobbing about the baby, all tagged with notes like increased compliance and medication successful. My stomach turned. More folders, charts tracking symptoms, dosage adjustments, like I was an experiment. But folder L made me run to the bathroom to vomit. Videos from his late meetings, him being intimate with another woman while I was home drugged to sleep. In one video, they both spoke about how Marcus was going to marry her after I was gone, and he would be able to step up and care for their baby. He said, "Another month and she'll be institutionalized, and I'll have financial control over everything she has." The front door clicked. He was home early. I slammed the laptop shut and ran to the bathroom. He knocked on the door asking if I was okay. His fake concern made me gag. He brought water and pills, watched me swallow, but I'd learned to hide them. That night I lay rigid beside him, planning. Who would believe me? The respected psychiatrist or his crazy wife? Morning came. While he showered, I grabbed his computer and forwarded all his files to every email he had saved. His colleagues, patients, mother, everyone. Then I ran. My phone started buzzing before I even checked in. Not Marcus, his colleagues. One after another calling to tell me I needed help. That Marcus was worried sick. That stealing patient files was a federal crime. Dr. Morrison, who I'd met at hospital fundraisers, left a voicemail saying he was deeply concerned about my mental state. My hands shook as I blocked each number, but they kept coming. Then came the text from my sister Diana. Marcus had called her crying, told her I'd had a psychotic break. She believed every word. Her message was full of concern and fear, begging me to check myself into a hospital. "He's worried sick about you," she wrote. "Please come home." I tried calling my mother, but Marcus had gotten to her first. She answered on the 3rd ring and immediately started crying. Said Marcus showed her security footage of me talking to myself in the kitchen, acting paranoid, pulling at my hair and muttering about cameras. I tried to explain, but she kept saying I needed to go back home, that Marcus only wanted to help me, that he loved me despite everything. I hung up and threw my phone across the room, watching it shatter against the wall. The motel clerk knocked on my door the next morning, said someone had called asking about me, described me perfectly. My blood froze. I packed my stuff and left through the back exit, abandoning the car in the parking lot. Found an ATM and pulled out as much cash as I could before Marcus froze our accounts, which he did. 2 hours later. The machine ate my card with a cheerful beep. I had $300 to my name. No car. No friends who'd believe me. The sun hit down mercilessly as I walked to a library and created a new email account. Started documenting everything I could remember. The dates he'd given me extra pills, the times I'd woken up confused with gaps in my memory, the weight loss that had happened so gradually I hadn't noticed until my wedding ring slipped off. Everything. My fingers flew across the keyboard, racing against time. Then I searched for lawyers, called 12 offices from the library's phone. Each one said the same thing. Without physical evidence of the substances in my system, I had nothing. One secretary whispered that Dr. Marcus Chen was well respected in the legal community, that I should be careful making accusations, that men like him had ways of making problems disappear. I spent that night in a rental car I'd gotten with the last of my credit before that got frozen too. Parked behind a grocery store, I finally broke down. Sobbed until my ribs hurt and my throat was raw. But crying wouldn't fix this. I needed proof. Real proof. Something that couldn't be explained away or twisted. The next morning, I drove back toward town. Not home, never home again. To the hospital where I'd lost the baby. Found the records department and requested my files. The clerk looked at her computer and frowned, her face shifting from professional courtesy to suspicion. Said there was a flag on my account, that my husband had power of attorney, that I'd need his written permission to access my own medical records. I ran out before security could arrive, my heart pounding in my ears. Back in the car, I remembered something. Dr. Patricia Wong. She'd been my OB before the miscarriage. Marcus didn't know about her because I'd switched doctors when we moved. She'd been kind, had held my hand during ultrasounds, and called me personally with test results. I drove to her office and begged the receptionist. Told her it was an emergency, that it was life or death. The woman must have seen something in my face because she disappeared into the back. Dr. Wong saw me between patients, took one look at me and closed the door, flipping the lock. I told her everything. The words poured out in a desperate rush. She listened without interrupting, her face growing more grave with each detail. Then she ordered blood work, said she'd rush it, call me with results. As the nurse drew vial after vial of blood, I prayed they'd find something, anything, proof that I wasn't crazy, that this nightmare was real. The results came back 3 days later. Dr. Wong called me herself, her voice tight with controlled anger. She'd found traces of benzodiazepines and antipsychotics in my system, substances I'd never been prescribed, substances that explained the memory gaps and constant exhaustion. She'd already made copies of everything and told me to come get them immediately. Her words came fast, urgent, like she was afraid someone might be listening. I drove there with my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. Finally had proof, real proof. The afternoon sun glared off the windshield as I navigated through traffic, my heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and terror. But when I got to her office, the receptionist looked confused. Said Dr. Wong had called in sick, that she'd left suddenly after getting an urgent phone call about a family emergency. My stomach dropped. Marcus had gotten to her somehow. The receptionist handed me an envelope though. Said Dr. Wong left it for me before she rushed out. Inside were the lab results and a sticky note with an address. A women's shelter 2 towns over. They can help, she'd written in hurried script. Ask for Joyce. Tell her I sent you. I drove straight there, checking my mirrors constantly. Every car that followed for more than 2 turns made my pulse spike. The shelter was an unmarked house on a quiet street, paint peeling slightly, garden deliberately overgrown to obscure the windows. Joyce turned out to be a former nurse who'd escaped her own nightmare. She took one look at my lab results and got on the phone. Started calling people, real people who understood, who'd been through this. Within hours, I had a lawyer who worked pro bono for abuse victims, Margaret Sullivan, a tiny woman with steel in her spine and eyes that had seen too much. She'd handled cases like mine before, knew how men like Marcus operated. She filed for an emergency protective order using the lab results as evidence. But the judge, an old golf buddy of Marcus's apparently, denied it. Said the substances could have been self-administered, that I needed more proof of threat. Margaret's jaw tightened at the ruling ruling, but she just nodded and said we'd find another way. So we kept building the case. I remembered the emails I'd forwarded from his computer. Margaret subpoenaed his email provider. It took weeks, but we got them. Every video, every note, every twisted documentation of his experiment. The screenshots made my skin crawl all over again. But his lawyer, some shark named Andrew Fitzgerald with perfectly white teeth and dead eyes, argued they were taken out of context. That Marcus was conducting legitimate research on grief with my consent. That I'd signed forms agreeing to it. Then Lauren surfaced, the woman from the videos. She showed up at one of our meetings with her own lawyer, wearing a designer maternity dress that probably cost more than I made in a month. Claimed the videos were therapy exercises. That Marcus was helping her work through intimacy issues after her divorce. She was 7 months pregnant by then, belly round and obvious. Looked me right in the eye and lied through her teeth. Said I was delusional. That Marcus had never been inappropriate with her. Her hand rested protectively on her stomach as she spoke. Wedding ring catching the light. But Margaret wasn't buying it. She dug deeper. Found out Lauren had deposited large sums of money right after each video date. Found hotel receipts Marcus had paid for. Found text messages between them on a phone Marcus thought he'd deleted. Explicit messages. Planning messages. Messages about their future together after I was gone. One particularly chilling exchange discussed how long it would take to have me declared mentally incompetent. The medical board finally opened an investigation. Took them 4 months just to look at the evidence. Marcus hired a whole team of lawyers who argued every point. Said the medications found in my system were prescribed by another doctor. Produced forged prescriptions with signatures that looked real enough. The board couldn't prove he'd written them. Their meetings dragged on, bureaucracy protecting him better than any lawyer could. Meanwhile, I was living in hiding, moving between shelters and cheap motels that smelled like cigarette smoke and broken dreams, working cash jobs, washing dishes, and cleaning offices. My hands grew rough from the constant exposure to cleaning chemicals, trying to rebuild while fighting a system that protected him. Some nights I'd wake up in a panic. Sure, I heard his car outside. Sure, he'd found me. The other women at the shelters understood. We'd sit together in the common room, sharing stories and strategies, building each other up when the system tried to tear us down. Then Marcus made a mistake. He got cocky, started dating publicly with Lauren while we were still married, posted photos on social media of them at medical conferences, her hand always positioned to show off an enormous diamond ring, her wearing jewelry I recognized. My grandmother's emerald ring that had gone missing months ago, the one my mother had worn at her wedding. Margaret screenshot everything, built a timeline showing their relationship started long before I left. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Marcus painted me as unstable, brought in colleague after colleague to testify about my erratic behavior at hospital events, how I'd seemed paranoid, how I'd made wild accusations. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, who I'd thought was a friend, testified that I'd seemed increasingly disconnected from reality at the last Christmas party. Each one was so convincing I almost believed them myself. But Margaret had prepared me, taught me to stay calm, to stick to facts, to let the evidence speak. We presented the lab results, the videos, the financial records showing Marcus had been slowly draining our joint accounts, moving money to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, preparing for a future without me. His lawyer argued I'd agreed to everything, that I was a willing participant in an unconventional but legal relationship. The judge, thankfully not one of Marcus's golf buddies, wasn't buying it. Judge Sarah Martinez had seen enough domestic abuse cases to recognize the patterns, but the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Marcus's patients, a young woman named Kimberly, came forward, said she'd overheard him on the phone with Lauren while waiting for her appointment, laughing about how easy it was to control me with the right cocktail of substances. She'd been too scared to say anything before, but seeing the news about our divorce gave her courage. She recorded part of the conversation on her phone. Her hands shook as she played it for us. The recording was damning. Marcus's voice clear as day talking about dosages, about how he'd learned exactly how much to give me to keep me compliant but not catatonic, how he'd practiced on other patients first, how Lauren was so much better than me because she understood his work, understood his brilliance. The medical board couldn't ignore that. The investigation suddenly moved much faster. They suspended his license pending full investigation. His practice partners distanced themselves immediately. The prestigious medical center where he'd built his reputation quietly removed his name from their website. Suddenly all those colleagues who defended him went silent. His reputation, the thing he'd valued more than our marriage, crumbled in weeks. But he still had money, still had connections, still had ways to make my life hell. He started with legal harassment, filing motion after motion, claiming I'd stolen his intellectual property, that I'd violated patient confidentiality by releasing the videos. Each claim was eventually dismissed but cost me money I didn't have in legal fees. Margaret worked overtime, often for free, but even she had limits. I sold everything I could, my engagement ring, the few pieces of jewelry he hadn't already taken, even my car, replacing it with a hit-up Honda that barely ran. Then came the stalking. Not him directly. He was too smart for that, but I'd see the same car parked outside wherever I was staying. A black sedan with tinted windows. Get calls from blocked numbers with just breathing on the other end. Find things moved in my motel room when I came back from work. Little things. A book placed differently. A window cracked open that I knew I'd locked, just enough to let me know someone had been there. The police said without proof it was connected to Marcus, they couldn't do anything. I started documenting everything, taking photos of the cars, recording the calls, keeping a detailed log of every incident in a notebook I carried everywhere. Margaret said we needed a pattern to show the court, but Marcus was careful. Nothing directly traceable to him. Always just enough distance to claim innocence. The stress was wearing me down, exactly as he'd intended. The divorce finally went through after 8 months of fighting. I got half of what was left after he'd hidden most of our assets. Enough to start over, but not enough to feel secure. The judge ordered him to pay alimony, but getting him to actually pay was another battle. He'd claimed financial hardship while living in a new house with Lauren, a sprawling colonial in the suburbs with a pool and 3-car garage. I thought it would end there, that he'd move on with his new life and leave me alone. But men like Marcus don't like losing, don't like their victims escaping. The harassment escalated. Dead flowers left on my car. Photos of me at work slipped under my apartment door. Always careful, always deniable. The stress was eating me alive. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. Developed insomnia that no amount of exhaustion could cure. Then I met other survivors, women who'd been through similar experiences with different men. We formed a support group that met in the basement of a community center every Thursday night. Started sharing resources and strategies. One woman, Jackie, had been through this for years. Taught us about documentation, about building cases that couldn't be dismissed, about playing the long game when the system failed us. She showed us how to use technology to our advantage. Apps that recorded locations and interactions automatically. We started a website, anonymous stories from survivors, resources for getting help, warning signs to watch for. It grew slowly at first, then faster as more women found us. Women who'd been told they were crazy, who'd been drugged and gaslit and controlled, who'd been failed by systems meant to protect them. Each story broke my heart and strengthened my resolve. Marcus found out about the website. Of course he did. Started threatening legal action for defamation even though we never used real names. Had his lawyer send cease and desist letters on expensive letterhead. But Margaret knew her stuff, knew exactly how to word things to stay legally protected while still telling the truth. The threats just made us more determined. We added more security features, moved to offshore hosting, created backup sites. 6 months after the divorce, I got a call from the medical board. They'd completed their investigation, found evidence of Marcus falsifying patient records, prescribing medications without proper documentation, using his position to experiment on vulnerable people. They revoked his license permanently. He couldn't practice medicine anywhere in the state. It was a victory but felt hollow. He still had money, still had freedom, still had ways to hurt people. Lauren left him 2 weeks after he lost his license. Apparently being married to a disgraced former doctor wasn't what she'd signed up for. She filed for child support immediately, claimed he'd lied to her about his situation, that she'd been a victim too. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered her laughing in those videos about my future institutionalization, about how easy it would be to convince people I was crazy. The website grew. We added forums where survivors could connect safely, legal resources sorted by state, therapists who understood medical gaslighting. It became a lifeline for so many women, and men too. We heard from dozens who'd been through similar experiences, who'd been told their reality wasn't real, who'd lost everything fighting to be believed. The community became stronger than any of us individually. Marcus tried to shut us down multiple times, filed complaints with hosting companies, claimed copyright infringement, harassment, even tried to buy the domain out from under us through shell companies. But we'd learned from him how to document, how to protect ourselves legally, how to build cases that couldn't be dismissed. Each attack just made us stronger, made our community tighter. We developed protocols, backup plans, ways to ensure the information would survive any attack. I started speaking at conferences about medical gaslighting, sharing my story with rooms full of healthcare workers. Some dismissed me, said I was bitter, that I was trying to destroy a good man's reputation. But others listened, really listened. Nurses who'd seen similar things but hadn't known what to do. Doctors who wanted to be better. Administrators who realized their systems had failed. After each talk, at least one person would approach me privately, sharing their own suspicions about a colleague. The speaking engagements led to consulting work. Hospitals bringing me in to train staff on recognizing abuse, on protecting vulnerable patients, on documentation that could stand up in court. It wasn't much money, but it was honest work. Work that mattered. Work that might save someone else from what I'd been through. I developed training modules, created assessment tools, built networks of professionals who understood. A year after the divorce, I got a call from Detective Nathan Rodriguez. They'd opened a criminal investigation into Marcus, found evidence he'd done this to other women, former patients who'd been too scared to come forward before. The detective had been building a case quietly, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to move forward. He'd been following our website, he admitted, seeing the patterns emerge. I met with 3 other women who'd been his victims. Marilyn, who'd been his patient 5 years before me. Elena, who'd worked as a nurse at his practice. And Susan, who'd been referred to him for anxiety treatment. Different times, different methods, but the same pattern. Isolation, medication, gaslighting, documentation. Each of us had pieces of the puzzle. Together we had enough for criminal charges, practicing medicine without a license, assault, fraud, the list went on. We spent hours in that conference room, comparing notes, finding connections we'd never seen alone. Marcus was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his new house. I wasn't there, but heard about it from Margaret, how he'd been calm, arrogant even. Sure, his lawyers would get him out of it, but the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple victims, financial records, his own documentation of his crimes. Even his lawyer looked worried at the bail hearing. The judge set bail at $2 million. He made bail, of course. Men like him always do. But he had to wear an ankle monitor. Couldn't leave the state. Couldn't contact any of the victims. The trial was set for 6 months out. 6 months to build an airtight case. 6 months for him to try every trick to wiggle out of it. But we were ready. We'd been preparing for this for years without knowing it. The other victims and I met regularly with the prosecutor. A woman named Assistant DA Pamela Park who specialized in cases like ours. She was thorough. Made us go over every detail multiple times. Prepared us for how his defense would try to discredit us. How they'd attack our credibility. Our mental health. Our motivations. But we were ready. We'd been attacked for so long that court felt like just another battle. We practiced testimony. Learned to stay calm under aggressive questioning. Supported each other through the hardest parts. Marcus tried everything. His lawyers filed motion after motion. Claimed the evidence was obtained illegally. That we were conspiring against him. That he was being persecuted for unconventional research methods. They brought in expert witnesses to argue the medications he'd given us were standard treatment. That we'd consented to everything. That our memories were unreliable due to trauma. One expert even suggested we'd formed false memories through our support group. But Pamela was better. For every expert they brought, she had 2. For every argument they made, she had evidence to counter it. She painted a picture of a man who'd used his position and knowledge to control and abuse vulnerable women. Who documented his own crimes out of arrogance. Who'd believed he was too smart to get caught. The evidence was methodical, overwhelming, undeniable. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of testimony that made me relive every moment. Every med hidden under my tongue. Every hour lost to drugged sleep. Every gaslight that made me question my own reality. But also 3 weeks of watching Marcus squirm. Watching his carefully constructed world collapse. Watching him realize he wasn't as smart as he thought. His face grew more haggard each day. The polished doctor facade cracking. The other victims were incredible. Each one strong in their own way. Marilyn spoke clearly about how he'd convinced her that her depression was getting worse, increasing her medications until she could barely function. Elena detailed how he'd threatened her job when she questioned his prescriptions. Susan explained how he'd used her trust to experiment with substance combinations. We supported each other during breaks. We'd been isolated for so long, but together we were unstoppable. Together we painted a picture the jury couldn't ignore. Marcus took the stand on the last day, still arrogant, still convinced he could talk his way out of it. He claimed everything was consensual research, that we'd agreed to participate in studies on grief and trauma, that the medications were carefully calibrated to help us heal, that he'd only ever wanted to help us. The prosecutor destroyed him, had him read his own notes out loud, explain his increased compliance comments, justify the hidden cameras and blocked phone numbers. By the end, even his own lawyer looked defeated. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. 6 hours that felt like 6 years. We waited in a small room, holding hands, barely speaking. When they came back, Marcus was standing straight, still sure he'd won. The foreman read guilty on all counts. Practicing medicine without a license, assault, fraud, stalking. The list went on. I watched his face change as each guilty verdict was read. Watched the arrogance drain away. Watched him realize he'd lost everything. Sentencing was a month later. The judge, a woman who'd clearly seen too many cases like this, didn't hold back. Called him a predator who'd used his education and position to prey on vulnerable women. Sentenced him to 15 years. Not enough for what he'd done, but more than we dared hope for. He was led away in handcuffs, no longer the respected doctor, but just another criminal.